Hello everybody, and welcome to our webinar today on using diagnostic questioning in online learning. My name is Kate Erica. I'm the Assistant Director here at Nord Anglia University, which is the professional development arm of Nord Anglia International Schools Group. Don't worry if you're unfamiliar with the term diagnostic questioning. This will be the focus of the whole of the second half of the webinar. So hopefully you were able to access the pre-webinar quiz on Google Forms. This was just to help me get to know your context a little so I can pitch the webinar in the right place. I've put everybody on mute with their videos off, but can I just check that everybody can hear me? So to do that, could you open up the chat function on your Zoom call by going to the three dots at the top of your screen, or it might be on the sidebar? And can you just type OK in if you can hear me in the message function there? Perfect. Thank you very much, everybody. That's fantastic. Okay, so I'll keep going here. I will allow more time for questions at the end. So for the time being, I'm just going to turn my chat function off for a little bit so I can concentrate on delivery. If you have any questions as we go, if you can just note them down, and then I'll leave 5 minutes for chatting later on. Okay, so if we just start with the idea of multiple choice quizzes. Multiple choice quizzes have quite a bad reputation. They're sometimes considered to be too simple and not particularly good at measuring deep thinking skills. However, when they're used well, multiple choice questions can be supportive of deeper learning and mastery of subject knowledge. They're particularly good at supporting recall and retention of knowledge, enabling students to return to previously learned content. And here I've got a little quote from Daniel Willingham, and he's my favorite educational psychologist. He works as a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. What he writes is that understanding is remembering in disguise. So that means that students can't really be considered to have learned something if they can't remember it when they need it. So enabling them to recall things at the point when they need that information is a key part of learning. And multiple choice questions are a good way to support this kind of recall and student memory of what they've learned. Also, multiple choice are a really good way to help us as teachers know if pupils have remembered what they've learned, if they've taken it in, and if they've understood what we've taught them. And that's a particularly important thing right now because we don't see our students much. We're all doing a lot of online learning, and we might not be getting many longer pieces of work submitted. So getting a little bit of quick real-time feedback is enormously helpful. So what I've got here is William's quite simple cognitive model of the learning process. And I'm using this to show just how memory and learning are interconnected, just a tiny bit of theory before we go into the more practical elements of multiple choice quizzing and diagnostic questions. So the learning process starts with the student paying attention to the learning environment with whatever information this contains. And that's represented on the screen on the left by the tree I've got there. But it might not be a tree. I mean, it could be what the teacher's saying. It could be a textbook. It's whatever they are learning from. And paying attention to this is where the learning process starts. Then the student will take what they've taken from the learning environment and put it into their working memory. So this is the size of awareness and thinking, the part we use when we're remembering things in the short term, I don't know, like a phone number or something we need to interact with at the time of use. To secure this information in the long-term memory, students need to interact with it, and they also need to repeat this interaction. So once things have gone into our long-term memory, they need to be recalled into the working memory and practiced with. It's this process of repetition and recall, this back and forth, represented by the purple arrows there, that secures the place of knowledge in the long-term memory. If information isn't revisited, then it will fall out of the working memory and into and be forgotten. And I'm sure we've all had that experience where we've crammed for a test and we can't remember it the day after we took the test. Likewise, if we put something in our long-term memory and we never interact with it again, then that gets forgotten too. For example, I learnt long division at primary school, but now it takes me quite a bit of practice again to remember how to do that fluently, and I'm far more likely to default to using a calculator. So it's that process of back and forth, that repetition that helps things stay into our memory, and that's how we can say that they've been truly learned. Another way of representing this is by thinking about how often we need to come back to things in order for them to stick. So Ebbinghaus's curve of forgetting, it's actually quite an old piece of research. Ebbinghaus, a psychologist, wrote this in the late 1880s, I think. But this shows that the first time we learn something, after 3 days, we only recall 60% of what we learned. If we return to it a day later, then it takes a little bit longer for us to forget the information. If we then return to it again after 3 days and again after 6, we retain it for a bit longer. And these blue bits here show the drop-off, show how long it manages to stay. And if we repeat it enough, it sticks. We keep it in our long-term memory. I found this model really useful when I was planning for my class, because especially when I was looking at classes that were preparing for examinations, because I found that thing, you've taught it and you've taught it to them well, but then they just don't remember it. Well, actually forgetting is a really natural part of the learning process. We need to forget and then come back to it in order for it to stick. So building in opportunities to come back to the information again and again is really important. One way of doing this is to begin lessons with review quizzes. And these review quizzes can use Ebbinghaus's research to mix questions from recent study with questions that look much further back. For example, the first question could retrieve key knowledge from last lesson. And maybe the second and third would also be focused on more recent study as well. Whereas question 4 would retrieve key knowledge from last week. Question 5 would retrieve it from last term, and question 6 would take the knowledge from last lesson and ask the student to connect it with knowledge from last term. So this might be if we take English literature or literacy, and we ask them to remember a character in their current book and compare with a character from a book they studied last term and think about the similarities between them. Or if we take a grammar example, if we take a piece of a grammatical structure that they've learned last lesson and ask them to write a sentence with that, plus a grammatical structure from the term before. These can be really good ways of making sure that we recall and interact with that information. So there are lots of platforms that help us with quizzing, help us to get fluent and help things stick in our long-term memory. For example, Quizlet is a really good platform for vocabulary. Our language teachers use it a lot in that it enables children to interact with vocabulary very frequently and gamifies the experience. Likewise, Times Table Rockstars is a great platform for encouraging fluency in times tables and maths. So if we move on now to the area of diagnostic questioning. Diagnostic questioning is a form of multiple choice questioning, but it works on the idea that every option is a misconception. So by looking at students' incorrect answers, it works as a form of formative assessment, meaning that we can take students' incorrect answers and then look at how we can change our planning going forward or change our feedback to that student going forward to make sure that we clear up the areas that they've misunderstood. Here's an example of a diagnostic question. And just to let you know, I'm taking the information on diagnostic questions here from a key research paper by Dylan Williams and Siobhan Leah. So I'm going to send it out after the webinar with a link to this recording. But if you're keen to get your hands on it, there's a link at the bottom there. So if we look now at this diagnostic question, I'll just give you a moment to think about this. So this question has been designed with 3 potential wrong answers, and each one addresses a key misconception that a student might have. Answer A is incorrect, and that answer would suggest that the student believes that to calculate the area of a rectangle, you're adding all the sides together. And that's instead of multiplying them. So adding the 2 numbers here, so 10 and 7 together, and that would give you 17. B is correct, it multiplies the 2. C is incorrect, that's the answer that gives this perimeter, so that's all 4 sides added together. And D is incorrect because this would suggest that the student had confused how you calculate area for a rectangle and how you calculate it for a triangle, because this is those 2 numbers multiplied and then divided by 2. So each one of those would tell us how the student was getting it wrong. Here's another example diagnostic question taken from science this time, also from the same research paper. So I'll just give you a moment to read it. Okay, so we look at the answers here. This first response A is typically selected by students who have the common sense idea that if there's no movement, there are no forces in play. The second B looks fairly reasonable. Is gravity pulling the idea down? Well, we know that that's gravity. Gravity works. We know that gravity works on everything. So response B will be quite attractive to many students. However, response C is what this teacher is looking for. She's been teaching that when there's no movement, this could either mean that there are no forces acting on the object, or more commonly, that the forces acting on the object are in equilibrium. This has been the focus of her physics lessons. So this is the answer that she's hoping students will give. D is similar to answer B. And E is selected by students who see inertia as a property of matter instead of a force. And this is an easy mistake to make because that's how we use inertia when we're talking about the word inertia. So the first and last responses are obviously incorrect, but B and D seem intuitively correct. However, the important thing here is that the teacher wants to know whether the students have understood what she's taught them, or if they've still got scientific misconceptions. Are they thinking like a physicist yet, or aren't they? And their answer to this will help her to understand that. So if we think about the uses of diagnostic questions here, diagnostic questions can be used as a unit pretest to gather information and common misconceptions about a topic. They allow teachers to adapt instruction for groups of students or individual students based on their answers that they give to the pretest. And then it also allows teachers to check what's been understood or misunderstood or miscommunicated after instruction, and then to potentially go back and reteach afterwards. If you want to make multiple choice questions, diagnostic multiple choice questions, you actually do it backwards. So what you start off with are the common misconceptions, the things that students will usually get wrong about the topic. And then you generate the multiple choice options that students would get with those, that students with those particular misconceptions would choose. So if we look at this question here, we've got some misconceptions that students might have, perhaps if they mistook the greater than and less than signs, if they confuse the two. Their answer to this question would let us know if they had that confusion. And it would also help us to know whether they understood the difference between the terms smaller than or less than. This question has been taken from the website diagnosticquestions.com, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that platform in a minute. So finally, once you've started with the misconceptions, you've generated your multiple choice options based on those, you can construct the question itself. So I'd like us to have a think now about how effective is this question as a diagnostic question. So which option shows the correct use of apostrophes? And I've put 4 options there. And what I'm asking you here isn't what's the correct answer, but do you think this is a good diagnostic question or not? So if you want to, you could put something in the chat function about whether you think this is a good one or not with a reason why, or you can just look at it and think. Okay, so let's have a little bit of a think about it then. Is this a good diagnostic question? Well, I wrote this earlier as an example, and I personally think this isn't a very good diagnostic question for a couple of reasons. First of all, there are 2 possible correct answers. Whilst that isn't always a problem, it doesn't really help me narrow down misconceptions here. And then there's also one very obvious incorrect answer. Now, I know when I've done multiple quizzes in the past that having one very, very obvious incorrect answer is quite common. There's one that you typically discount. But having that when you're doing a diagnostic question essentially wastes an option that you could have used to address a misconception. The only one here that presents a common misconception is option A. And this one would let me know that our student might be confusing plurals, when you don't use an apostrophe, with the idea of possessives. Yes, so somebody's put here, Julie, thank you. Yes, some of the answers are useful as a diagnostic and some are not, and that's exactly what I think too. That actually one of the answers is useful, and the correct one might be useful to show me they understood it, but others were not so great, especially option D. So this is a more effective example of a diagnostic question. Does anybody want to share why they think this one might be a bit better? Why is this a better diagnostic question? Okay, thanks, Janice. So there is only one correct answer in this one, B. B lets us know that they've understood it. Both option A, yes, thank you, Julie. The other 2, both option A and option C, show a specific misconception. So option A tells me that they don't know where to place the apostrophe, and option C shows me both that and that they might be confusing this idea of plurals and possessives. Now, I've only put 3 options here. So that might be a little simple. It might be possible for my students to just guess what the right answer is. And if I wanted to eliminate that option, I can do one of 2 things. I could repeat this question in a different format and let them have a couple of goes. Or I could put an explanation box in the bottom where they have to say exactly how they managed to get that answer. And by getting them to write an explanation in, it will help me to understand whether they knew why that was the right answer or not. So what makes a good diagnostic question? Well, 4 things. They can be answered in no more than 30 seconds. They are quick. They're not multi-step. I know there are some really good examples of multi-step, multiple choice questions out there, but with this kind of diagnostic question, you want them to stay simple because you want to know exactly where the misconception lies. You learn something from each incorrect answer, as we found out just then, and that you can't arrive at the correct answer while still having key misconceptions. And for that, you might have to repeat the same kind of question more than once in your quiz, or have an explanation box. So the website I was referring to just now is diagnosticquestions.com. This website is championed by Dylan William as a really good source of diagnostic questions that are written for you. There are lots and lots on there, mostly maths, some computing and some science, but you can also write your own and add them to the body of knowledge if you wanted to. There's the facility to add your own questions in. It's a free platform, and so it's useful for creating the quizzes. However, the best thing about it is also the useful analytics. So once your students have done the quiz, it will present you with some graphs. So if we look at the feedback and analysis, this is taken from some work that one of our maths teachers did in secondary. but it's also perfectly applicable for primary as well. So we can see on this that question 10 was the question that our students didn't do very well on. In fact, of the 7 students who attempted it, 5 got it wrong. So what happened? So we can pull up question 10 over here, and we can see which options, which misconceptions the students selected. And then by hovering over each dot, it will let us know which student that was. There's also an explanation box in this question. And that was, if they just guessed, they could fill that in. And the student who selected option A just guessed. So the teacher was able to give feedback and let the student know that actually they needed to go back and do some review. The student who selected option D showed their workings. And this wasn't the correct answer either, so the teacher would be able to give feedback on where their workings went wrong. Our maths teacher is currently working on how to use this more fluently and respond to pupils individually through the platform at the moment. Diagnostic questions is not the only way of doing quizzing. There are many other quizzing platforms out there, and some of them offer the same kind of features. So I like using Google Forms because it provides me with the same kind of analytics in the forms of spreadsheets and graphs that I can then use to be responsive in my teaching. I know that Quiz with Microsoft Forms as well can be used within Teams if you're using Teams for your teaching. And then things like Kahoot gamify the experience, and Nearpod is a way of also enabling collaborative features. So there are lots of different ways of doing this, and you can construct your own diagnostic questions within these platforms. But looking at the website diagnostic questions is helpful if you want to see how these are constructed and how they can be used. So in summary, here are some key points on what the research says about why multiple choice quizzing and diagnostic questioning can be useful. Multiple choice retrieval supports recall and helps students to retain learning. And the more often we go back to key information, the more likely we are to secure it in long-term memory. Carefully designed multiple choice questions can assess higher order thinking skills, such as observation and measurement. And also, if you get students to explain their answers, it can give you a deeper understanding of what they have and haven't learned, and you can give feedback. And then as a bonus, and this really surprised me, multiple choice questions can enhance learning for related information that wasn't even on the quiz. And this is from Bjork et al. He is a really influential researcher into the idea of memory. And so I think this is what this is saying, is when you think back to what we learned previously, even if we're not being asked about all of it, we do remember more than what the specific question is asking for. If you're interested in the idea of memory and learning, I've also put a link to some of these publications in a wider area of publications at the bottom. So there's a bibliography here, and I will be sending this out as a PDF so that if you want to click through and look at any of these sites in more detail or look at any of this research in more detail, then feel free to. Okay, so if we go back to the chat function now, does anybody have any questions? Nope, if not, it's not a problem. We don't have to deal with any questions now. I'm also available to be emailed. So when I send out your information after this webinar, you can respond to me directly there. Julie, you said you have a recommendation and some advice. Would you mind sharing it for us on the chat?
Can you hear me? I've just unmuted my microphone. That might be a bit more efficient.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, great. So with the whole school closure, I'm trying some of these new some of these new kind of ways of doing my formative assessment, and I just want to share a couple of mistakes with people so that you don't make the same ones. But with Google Forms, the first time I used it, I made the mistake of not making question 1 to ask their names.
Okay.
and then I had to go back and ask everybody roughly when they did it. So that was a bit tricky. So yeah, if you use Google Forms, I don't know whether we have the setup for making it anonymous, but yeah, I now make sure that the first question is their name. And then when I use the diagnostic questioning, I do tend to use the box to get the explanations out, because
Okay.
I think students explaining their work is a really, really important skill to do the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah.
That's really helpful, Julie. Gemma, you've put, do you think this could be effective in online classes? I think it could be really effective in online classes. Janice, you've put, you did the same thing there. Does anybody want to unmute their microphone and let us know if they have found this method of using multiple choice questioning effective when teaching online at the moment?
Well, I've got another option actually. I found out that using Kahoot, if you set, instead of pressing the play button in Kahoot and you press the button, it's right next to it that says challenge, you can set it over a period of time. So if you want to use Kahoot, so the wonderful thing about Kahoot is that there are quizzes that people have already written, or you can just edit a quiz that someone else has written. So if it's on something quite kind of basic, then you can use pre-made quizzes to improve ones that are already there, or just use, you know, there are fantastic ones that are just ready to use. So if you can use it as a challenge, it's great at the moment during the school closure, because students who aren't in the Hong Kong time zone and cannot get to lessons on time, I give them kind of like 24 hours or 36 hours or something so that they can then do that in their own time. And then when we come to the next lesson, I can then review that and see what everybody got. And then in that lesson, I can then go through the questions, and it actually comes up with, there's actually like a little subcategory that says difficult questions. So I don't quite know what makes a difficult question, whether it's less than 50% or whatever, but you can then review the questions that the students got wrong in the next lesson. So the Kahoot challenge is a way of delaying the Kahoot game so that everybody can play it just in their own time. And I wish I found that out 2 weeks earlier than I did.
Fantastic, that's really helpful, thank you. Okay, has anybody else got anything?
Hi, it's Gemma.
Hey, Gemma.
So basically, I just had a thought that maybe it would be something like you could ask, looking at the retention of knowledge and encouraging commitment to long-term memory. And I was thinking maybe you could be using sort of the multiple choice questions throughout the week based on what you're learning online, and you know, via a Google form or however, and then sort of Friday make a learning session based around addressing issues that were coming up in the Google forms of things that people weren't understanding.
That sounds great. Having a review session and a misconception session, I think students would find it really valuable. I think one of the things that we know, I mean, our students sometimes struggle with is staying on top of all the content. And so stopping for review and feedback can be incredibly useful. Definitely, and also supporting that idea that we're putting it into long-term memory. Okay. Oh, thank you, Ben. Okay, so I think we're going to move on now, otherwise we're going to hit our Zoom time limit. So this is our first time doing this online. Like everybody else, we're getting used to the webinar format. So in appropriate style, it would be great if I could get your feedback on this. There's a QR code here if you'd like to access it on screen, or you can access it via the link when I send this around as a PDF. And if you could just give me a little bit of feedback on how this has gone, that means that next time we do a webinar, and we're hoping to make this a regular thing, especially while schools are closed, but also maybe moving forward as well. It would really help me know what I need to adapt and do differently next time. So thank you very much to everybody for participating. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have as well. And I look forward to seeing you at the next one.